joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I am delighted to welcome you to the latest in our Artist and Inspiration series. This is William J. Stillman's Photographic Studies in the Adirondacks. I'm Laura Rice. I'm the Chief Curator at the Adirondack Experience. I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and lifeways. Tonight, we're joined by Diane Wagner, Curator of Photographs at the National Gallery of Art. Dr. Wagner received her PhD in art history from Yale University. At the National Gallery since 2004, Dr. Wagner has curated several exhibitions, most recently East of the Mississippi, 19th Century American Landscape Photography. There's also an excellent publication that went along with it, so if you missed the exhibition, please look into the book. It's really terrific. Tonight, she'll be speaking about a significant set of photographs from our own collection, the Adirondack work of William James Stillman, some of which you'll be able to see in 2023 with the opening of our new long-term exhibition, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild. Throughout the evening, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Wagner will address your questions at the end of her presentation. With that, I will turn it over to you, Diane.
All right, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I also just want to thank you for the invitation to come speak in this series. So let me share my screen. Okay, is that, can everyone see that fine? Okay. Well, so as Laura mentioned, my talk this evening is going to focus on the work of a really fascinating 19th century polymathic figure, William James Stillman. He played a pivotal role in mid-19th century American painting and photography, though his art has remained somewhat obscure as there are very few paintings and photographs by him that survive, although, of course, as Laura mentioned, there are some in the collection of the Adirondack Experience that we'll be looking at later on this talk. But Stillman served as a critical bridge between American and British artists as a disciple of the eminent British art critic John Ruskin. He was a prominent writer who was fundamental to bringing Ruskin's ideas to America through the editorship of the art journal that he co-founded in 1858 called The Cran, and through the significant art criticism that he continued to write for many decades. But it's the 1850s, which is the decade that I'll be focusing on in this talk, in which he was a seminal artist working in both landscape painting and photography. And his approach to landscape was in part founded upon the time that he spent in the Adirondacks, which was a place where he found a very deep spiritual solace. So to begin, and of course here you can see this is his self-portrait that I'm showing you on the screen here when he was a young man. So to begin, I want to consider the state of landscape painting in America in the late 1850s and a little bit into the 1860s, and the impact that Ruskin had and the impact that photography had on it, as well as Stillman's role in this development. So this is a vibrant watercolor by John Ruskin, which is now known as Fragment of the Alps, though Ruskin himself called it a study of a block of gneiss. And in it, you can see that he very intricately renders the contours of stone in very delicate grays and vivid coppers, and that the stone is foregrounded against a very deep, dark emerald of the trees and a cobalt blue in the sky, which he conveyed by a more broadly applied wash of color. And in 1863, Stillman wrote of Ruskin's watercolor that calling it the pinnacle of, quote, direct copying of nature. And this is what he wrote this in a journal called The New Path, which was a successor to Stillman's own journal, The Cran, whose editorship he had left in 1856. And The New Path had been founded that year and published by a group of artists who had just formed what would be the short-lived Association for the Advancement of Truth in Art. And I'll talk a little bit more, and they came to be called the American Pre-Raphaelites. And I'll talk a little bit more later about that, what that meant later on in this talk. Now, Stillman wasn't a member of this group, but he, in fact, was the very first artist to be called an American Pre-Raphaelite, and he served as a slightly older mentor to them. But Ruskin's work was really an exemplar to these American artists as well as Stillman, as it was the embodiment of his ideals advocating that artists should observe nature closely and transcribe it faithfully. The watercolor itself was owned from 1858 by Bostonian Charles Eliot Norton, who was a prominent man of letters and later Harvard art historian, as well as a friend of Stillman. And the watercolor had been displayed in what was called the Exhibition of English Art that had toured New York, Boston, and Philadelphia in 1857 and 1858, which afforded many American artists the opportunity to see Ruskin's work in person. Now, Stillman continued on to describe the watercolor as the great boulder, as it were, photographed in color, every hue of its wonderfully varied colors, every irregular split and crack and broken surface, every substance inlaid in its mass like a precious stone in a Florentine mosaic, every incrustation is given with faultless mirror-like accuracy. Now, he signed the article JS, and I just, as an aside, I want to credit a scholar of the American Pre-Raphaelites, Sophie Linford, who is the one that initially identified that this article was by Stillman just a few years ago. Now, in Stillman's description of Ruskin's watercolor, he brings together two critical strands that exerted an enormous influence on American art practice. On the one hand, Ruskin's ideas on the importance of the close observation of nature, and on the other hand, the effect that the invention of photography had on artists. Now, as exemplified by his own watercolor, Ruskin famously exhorted artists in his seminal 1843 publication of the first volume of his epic series, Modern Painters, to go to nature, quote, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth, unquote. His ideas linking the faithful observation of nature with a higher religious and moral dimension electrified painters, first in Britain and then America. And they led to a seminal shift in artistic practice and style toward a more precise realism in the mid-19th century. Now, in Britain, this took the form of the radical rebellion of pre-Raphaelitism. In here, I show you two paintings made by the British Pre-Raphaelites. One is Ford Madox Brown's An English Autumn Afternoon, and then William Holman Hunt's The Light of the World, both from the early 1850s. And these are both paintings that toured America in that same exhibition of English art with Ruskin's watercolors in the late 1850s. Now, the British Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood had formed in 1848, and they were a group of young British artists that came together to defy the artistic conventions of the day, galvanizing the art world with their paintings. They derived their name from their conviction that only art made before the time of the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael was honest and true, hence the term Pre-Raphaelite. But they eschewed the loose brushwork, idealized form, and gradation of light and dark that was characteristic of art practice at the time. And the Pre-Raphaelites, heeding Ruskin, instead painted the details of landscape directly from nature, closely observing and firmly delineating its outlines and flooding their canvases with brilliant, vivid, all-over color. Yet Stillman's description of Ruskin's study as, quote, photographed in color highlighted another vital influence on this aesthetic shift in handling, which of course was photography, the invention of which was announced to the world in 1839. Now, as the painter Paul Delaroche famously declared upon learning of the miraculous ability of photography to record the world without the intervention of the human hand, from today, painting is dead. But of course, painting was not dead, but would, however, be radically altered by the existence of photography. And as you can see in Brown and Hunt's paintings, photography inevitably influenced the practice of the British pre-Raphaelites as it sharpened artistic vision and handling, even though the artists seldom acknowledged the new medium's influence. Photography's very existence posed an inherent challenge to art making, and American artists too responded to it. Now, Americans very quickly embraced photography with the French invention of the daguerreotype, which was named after its creator, Jacques-Louis Mondé Daguerre, becoming the dominant process in use in America during the first decade and a half of photography's existence. And Stillman even talks about being rather fascinated by daguerreotypes at a younger age. And I'm showing you here just two examples. On the left, you see Southworth and Hawes' Portrait of a Woman. Southworth and Hawes operated one of the most successful and prominent studios in Boston. And then you see Platt Babbitt's view of Niagara Falls on the right. And Babbitt had a camera set up right on the side of Niagara Falls where tourists could come and then have their picture taken the way you see here with their backs to the camera as they are contemplating the sublime vista of Niagara Falls. Now, the daguerreotype was made on a silver-coated copper plate, and it was praised for its crystalline clarity and its ability to capture the minutiae of faces, of nature, and of architecture in a way that the hand of the artist could not. And though there were some examples of photographs of landscape views, like the Babbitt of Niagara Falls that I just showed, the daguerreotype was primarily a portrait medium in America. And landscape photography itself as an artistic endeavor took longer to take hold in America than it did in Britain or France. And as we'll see, Stillman played an important part in that development. Now, by the mid-1850s, the daguerreotype began to be superseded by paper and glass processes. And here I'm just showing you two examples of salted paper print portraits that were probably made from glass negatives. So by the mid-1850s, photography had really become a prominent part of life in America, and there was a thriving community of photographers in both large cities and small towns that was very firmly established. So Stillman, as he was, would have become very familiar with this even before he took up photography himself. And photography would thus prove to exert an influence on American artists' ways of seeing and their attempt to find a fresh visual language. Photography endowed the role of description and detail with a new importance, contributing to the rise of realism as an aesthetic mode. The peculiarities of photographic vision, which flattened forms and abruptly cropped the visual field, began to make their way into painting, serving as a marker of fidelity to observation and propelling artists like the young American pre-Raphaelites towards a microcosmic focus on the myriad details of nature. And you can see that particularly in the example I'm showing you here on the right by one of the American pre-Raphaelites, Aaron Draper Shattuck, in his leaf study. And indeed, as we saw in Stillman's description of the Ruskin watercolor, he invoked photography as really a guarantor of realism. Now, to show a little more clearly this shift towards American Ruskinian practice, I'm showing you here Thomas Cole's a view of the mountain pass called the Notch of the White Mountains, which was painted in 1839, the very year of photography's introduction to the world. Now, Cole's painting really implements the conventions of the picturesque. So as we see, the view is framed here at the sides by tree stumps, and your eye is drawn back into the depth of the painting by a pathway. And you can see that with the road, with the figure on horseback there in the middle ground of Cole's painting. And while the details of the plants and the stumps in the foreground and the autumnal trees that cover the cliffs on either side of the notch are rendered legibly, they nevertheless have a softness of outline, a style that would generally shift among painters in mid-century in favor of precise representation of detail after the advent of photography. Such that by the 1850s and into the early 1860s, American artists produced canvases such as these paintings by Asher B. Durand, who was himself a leading proponent of Ruskin's call to record nature faithfully alongside Stillman, and William Trost Richards, an artist who was associated with that group of American Pre-Raphaelites, though he didn't formally belong to the group. And you can see that their work was really dramatically informed by this simultaneous emergence of both Ruskin's call for truth to nature and the acknowledged capacity of photography to record the observable world. And Stillman really served as a key conduit in America for this shift as American artists adopted these Ruskinian tenets. And more than any other American artist of the time, Stillman's work made manifest this convergence of these new visual approaches between photography and painting, because he was one of the only ones to take up both painting and photography at the same time. Now, Stillman led a very remarkable, varied life. He was born in Schenectady, New York in 1828 to a family that he described as honest mechanics. And he graduated from Union College in Schenectady in 1848. And then he settled in New York as a young man, very full of aspirations to make his way in the world and to make his way as an artist. He had read Ruskin's first volume of Modern Painters, which was published in America in 1847. And he later recalled that he had, quote, absorbed the views of Ruskin in large drafts. The art-loving public was full of Ruskinian enthusiasm, and what strength I had shown was in that vein, unquote. He was supposed to study with Thomas Cole, who in fact rarely accepted pupils, but Cole unfortunately died before Stillman could start his studies with them. And then he briefly studied with Frederick Edwin Church, who was Cole's student, but it wasn't a very long-lived or successful relationship. Now, Stillman traveled to London for the first time in 1850 and a second time in 1853. And there he met Ruskin himself and many other British artists. He also first viewed the works of Turner that Ruskin had written about so extensively in Modern Painters, and he had his first sight of paintings by the British Pre-Raphaelites, most notably John Everett Millais. And he mentions in particular the Millais painting that I'm showing you here, The Proscribed Royalist, as he reminisced years later that Millais, quote, impressed me very strongly. In fact, it determined me in the manner in which I should follow art on my return home, unquote. Back in America, he spent the next several years, as he described, quote, given to hard and monotonous painting from nature while the weather permitted, unquote. And he exhibited many large studies of nature. He was elected to the National Academy of Design, and that's when he began to be called the American Pre-Raphaelite. And he was really the first American painter to be called that. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, very few of Stillman's paintings survive. And one of the few that does survive is one of the Adirondacks, his study on Upper Saranac Lake, Adirondack Woods, which is now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Now, Stillman suffered from bouts of illness and depression. And during these times, he always sought out the solace of nature, spending time in the White Mountains and the Adirondacks. And these, of course, were the places that became the chief subjects of his landscape paintings. Now, during these sojourns, he discovered a profound love for solitude and nature infused with a strong sense of spirituality, which is evident in the painting. He also became a very skilled woodsman, often camping in the woods in complete isolation. Now, he completed this painting in 1854 after his first trip to the Adirondacks. It shows a view of the lake through the trees, but you can see that Stillman really lavished his attention on the foreground, endeavoring to precisely capture not only the mottled tones and textures of the tree trunks and the rocks, soil, and plant cover of the forest floor, but also the complex play of shade and sunlight over these forms. And though he adopted a darker palette, which is more akin to the paintings of Asher B. Durand and other American artists who had studied in Dusseldorf, than to the brilliant luminosity of British pre-Raphaelite paintings, such as the Millet that he had seen in London, Stillman nevertheless demonstrated his Ruskinian bona fides by his intensely faithful adherence to his subject. Now, 2 years later, he made a smaller painting of a more distant view in the White Mountains of Mount Chocorua. And here you can see that he really used that same darker palette, but again applied that hyper intensity of line and detail. Now, around the same time, Stillman delivered a very bold statement on the way that photography newly tested painters. He wrote, "Studies from nature that would once have been considered satisfactory when placed by the side of a photograph become poor things, and their artist must improve or be neglected. Photographs are a standard, infallible so far as they go, and artists must either give something which the daguerreotype cannot attain, or do something which can approach it in fidelity. This effect cannot be otherwise than beneficial, since on the perfect observance of truth, all other qualities of art are based. And in truth, it would seem that as our powers of observation become microscopic, they become telescopic also, i.e., the more minutely we see, the more we see." Now, Stillman's remark highlighting the sharpening of vision that photography made essential was published in The Cran, the journal that I mentioned earlier, which he had co-founded in 1855 with Asher B. Durand's son, John. And The Cran was really instrumental in bringing Ruskin's writings and ideas to an American audience. It was a very ambitious publication for two young men to undertake, and the journal very quickly earned praise, though it was never a success financially. But the editors secured writings from prominent literati, such as poet, essayist, and editor James Russell Lowell and poet William Cullen Bryant, and they even published Ruskin himself. Now, Stillman left the editorship of The Cran in 1856, citing mental and physical exhaustion, but his important contribution as editor had already left its mark on the American art world. And as we've seen, he continued to write for a number of different art publications. Furthermore, Stillman, more than any other painter working at the time, brought together both Ruskinian philosophy and American transcendentalism. Stillman intensely admired James Russell Lowell, with whom he became acquainted in the early 1850s. And Lowell introduced him to Charles Eliot Norton, who was the later owner of Ruskin's watercolor, and Norton became a close friend of Stillman as well as a financial supporter. And Lowell also introduced him to others in his circle of Boston intellectuals that included philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson and Louis Agassiz, the Harvard naturalist who later prominently disagreed with Darwin's theories. And Stillman wrote many letters to Norton in which he ruminated expansively on the divine presence that he felt in nature. He recalled later, quote, "It has been my habit for many years at all times when I found myself broken down by fatigue to resort to the wilderness for recuperation, and I have lured wiser men and better workers to follow me and find renewal," unquote. Now, and then in 1858, which was 4 years after his painting of the study in Upper Saranac Lake, Stillman lured some of these wiser men to go on a really extraordinary camping expedition. And he served as a guide to James Russell Lowell, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Louis Agassiz, and 7 others, as well as they were also accompanied by several local Adirondack guides in 1858 at Follinsby Pond in the Adirondacks. And this was a gathering that they dubbed the Philosophers Camp, and it led to the founding of the so-called Adirondack Club. So along with Stillman's Adirondack painting, the other major painting from his career that survives is his study of that historic gathering of these men who so critically shaped the way that white American settlers conceived of the natural environment. Called Morning at Camp Maple, Adirondack Woods, It's set in the forest clearing where the men built shelter and camped. So Stillman divided the participants into two groups. So here we see on the left, that's Agassiz, who is standing there behind the tree stump, and he's flanked by scientists Estes Howe and Dr. Jeffries Wyman. And then that's John Holmes, the brother of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is seated there. And then on the far left, we see one of those local Adirondack guides. And then the group on the right shows the men engaging in target practice. So we see jurist Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, Lowell himself, Lowell, who's there in brown, and then Stillman himself, who's just behind Dr. Amos Binney, who is the one who's holding a gun. And then another camper is Horatio Woodman, who is there seated on the ground. And then the three figures there on the far right wearing the white shirts are others of the local Adirondack guides that accompanied them. And then the central figure is Emerson himself, where he occupies the center. And of course, you can see that he is standing alone and really observing all the activities of the rest of the camping group. So not only was Stillman thus guiding these men's experience of nature as the sort of lead guide who set up this camping trip, he also in his painting really represents their physical and mental exertions as they studied and lived immersed in the forest. Sunlight streams in through the trees to bathe them with bright light, which conjures a sense of their communion with nature. Though it is, in fact, the guides that really stand out the most as the sunlight hits their white shirts and their bodily stances, as Stillman has painted them, really shows their ease within the forest setting. Now, after the rest of the party departed for Boston, Stillman stayed on in the Adirondacks by himself, where he wrote to Norton that he was rapturously, quote, rowing, hunting, fishing, and exploring new recesses of that marvelous forest, which buries me deeper each time I enter it, unquote. Now, critically, Stillman was again the first to bring these philosophical threads to the practice of photography. He had made his first foray into making photographs not long before on a trip to Florida, though no photographs from that trip have survived. The following year, in 1859, Stillman returned again to the Adirondacks, camping on this trip with a smaller group from the Adirondack Club on a tract of land at Ampersand Pond that he had purchased the previous winter on behalf of the Adirondack Club, with the intention, though it was never really realized, that it would serve as the club's permanent camping site. And after the other men left on this second trip, Stillman again remained by himself as he had done the year before, in hopes of improving his fatigue and his low spirits. He wrote again to Charles Eliot Norton that, quote, I have not done much on my picture. So he must have been working on a landscape painting at the time as well. But I have chopped wood, rode, taken photographs about the camp in the intervals of the shower, sketched some, and hunted more. And he closed the letter by noting, quote, I have made some very nice little photographs of forest subjects. Now, Stillman then assembled these forest subjects as a portfolio, which he titled Photographic Studies by W.J. Stillman, Part 1, The Forest, Adirondack Woods, though a Part 2, as far as we know, never materialized. And here I'm showing you the portfolio cover, as well as the opening photograph, where we can see the inscription Photographic Studies up above, and it's a little bit harder to see embedded within the dirt and the twigs, is also dedicated to the Adirondack Club. Now, these photographs, which were albumin prints made from wet collodion glass negatives, and by that time, that was the most dominant photographic process in use at the time. They were truly unprecedented excuse me, they were truly unprecedented within American photography, with Stillman employing Ruskinian art theory and practice in his choice of subject and compositions. Now, very few copies of this portfolio survive, and it's probable that they were produced just for distribution to the members of the Adirondack Club. And each one that does survive contains a slightly different number of photographs. So it's not certain how many were in the original, but there are now 15 known images that are extant. And I know of 4 copies of this portfolio. One is at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. One is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. One is at the Milne Library Special Collections at SUNY College Geneseo, and one, very fittingly, is in the Adirondack Experience Museum collection. So I want to take a close look at each of the photographs in the Adirondack Experience portfolio, which I was fortunate enough to be able to see, I think maybe about five years ago when I visited. And it contains 14 out of the 15 known prints, so it is almost a complete set. Now, unlike the painting Morning at Camp Maple, in which Stillman had shown the party of wilderness seekers ensconced in their camp with the material necessities of tent and lean-to shelter combined with the figures as evidence of their communal gathering, in the forest photographs, humans are entirely absent. There are only 2 that allude to a human presence, and one of them is the one that I'm showing you here, which shows the camp shelter, which of course you can see is very similar to the one that Stillman painted from the year before. But this, in fact, is the one photograph that is not in the Adirondack Experience Museum portfolio. And this one, which is in the Adirondack Experience portfolio, is the one other photograph that gives you some evidence of a human presence with a lean-to from the camp. So here are 3 more from the portfolio. And Stillman's strategies of composition included this particular technique of vignetting, and we saw that also with the opening photograph from the portfolio. And here, the round shape of the photographic image evokes, of course, both the circular camera lens as well as the human eye. Now, in the one on the left, you see that it's a snow scene, and that really shows us just how late into the year Stillman remained in the Adirondacks, that he was photographing even when snow was on the ground. And there the pictorial viewpoint really corresponds to the camera's height on a tripod, which is pointed straight into the forest, as if it's really a keyhole into at least what Stillman perceived as an untouched world. Now, in the other 2, you see we see a glimpse of forest floor that packs the foreground, while the remainder of the image is occupied by the slope of rock that's covered with mosses or lichen and thin branches and sparse leaves. And in the one on the right, excuse me, we also see the diagonal line of a felled log crossing on the left. Now, in others, in which Stillman did not use the vignette format, he fills the frame from the forest floor, moving up through the trees to sunlight shining through in the distance. And you can see that all 3 of these center a very strong diagonal silhouette of a tree trunk or multiple tree trunks. These are 3 more from the portfolio that really offer an even more disorientating perspective, where Stillman has focused so closely in on the branch or stone, just filling the frame, that it's hard to even really orient yourself as to where you are. These are 2 more as well that also have disorientating perspectives. On the left, Stillman's captured a vertical slope with a tree growing out of it. And it's almost hard to even know what we're looking at and whether it's horizontal or vertical until you notice the trees there on the left in the background. And in the one on the right, we're almost placed in a worm's eye view, where we're situated down at the bottom and looking up at a very steep raked angle. Now, the only photograph in the portfolio that gives us a more conventional view is this one, which shows a vista across the lake. And here we can much more easily read the topography of the landscape that we're looking at. But each of these photographs really invokes that sense of microscopic seeing that Stillman had described earlier in the Cran, as well as the destabilizing, dizzying effect imparts that sense of full immersion into the woods, just as Stillman described experiencing it in his letters to Norton. Now, these close-up views, some of them very much echoed Stillman's own painting, Saranac Lake, that we saw earlier, as well as the paintings by Asher B. Durand with these glimpses into the forest. But the photographs are even more radical than their painted counterparts, because unlike the paintings, there is no far vista in most of them. Instead, nature crowds around and encroaches. Now, the Ruskinian characteristics of Stillman's photographs were understood by his contemporaries, and they were interpreted, as were his paintings, as models of Ruskinian realism. The forest portfolio received one mention in the press, which was in the Atlantic Monthly, which was then under the editorship of James Russell Lowell, of course, who had been part of the Philosophers Camp excursion. And it's not hard to imagine that Lowell was one of the recipients of a copy of the portfolio from Stillman. So Lowell emphasized the Ruskinian qualities of the photographs, echoing Stillman's own comments about photography allowing us to see microscopically, writing, oops, sorry, I'm missing a slide, but writing, quote, "One may study these pictures till he becomes as familiar as a squirrel with fern and tree bark and moose wood and lichen, till he knows every trunk and twig and leaf as intimately as a sunbeam." So in the description that he gave of Stillman's photographs, Lowell is explicitly highlighting that perspective so that we can imagine we as viewers are there on the forest floor like a squirrel, intimately observing every detail of nature, just as Stillman himself did while camping in isolation. Now, after producing the Adirondack portfolio, Stillman never resided permanently in the United States. He sailed for London in 1860, where he reconnected with Ruskin and the British art community. But he did come back to the United States periodically, and he continued to visit areas like the Adirondacks and the White Mountains. So he compiled albums with yet more landscape photographs that included pictures that he made in the White Mountains, which exhibit some of the same hallmarks as his forest pictures. And I'm showing you just two examples here. It's not clear exactly when he made these photographs. His first visit to the White Mountains was in 1856 when he painted Mount Chocorua, but at that point he had not acquired a camera. So I believe that these were probably made in the late 1860s on one of those subsequent trips back to the United States. And here you can see, again, those similar compositions to the forest photographs. In the one on the left, we have that forest undergrowth dominating the foreground and a perfectly centered tent there, sort of glowing through the trees in the middle ground, where we would probably assume that Stillman was camping. And we only see a very small glimpse of sky through the treetops at the top of the picture. And then the photograph on the right is very similar to the Adirondack photographs, with the foreground undergrowth leading back to light shining through the trees. So, but beyond the Ruskinian aspects of Stillman's photographs, he also, his photographs really suggest that he was searching for a way to express his own spirituality, as well as the transcendentalism of Emerson, which was fostered by that time that they spent together in the woods at the Philosophers Camp in 1858. And Stillman recalled in his autobiography at the end of his life that, Quote, Emerson and I had many hours alone on the lake and in the wood. He seemed to be a living question, perpetually interrogating his impression of all that there was to be seen. The rest of us were always at the surface of things. Even the naturalists were only engaged with their anatomy, but Emerson in the forest, or looking at the sunset from the lake, seemed to be looking through the phenomena, studying them by their reflections on an inner speculum. So while Stillman evoked Emerson's powers of observation in the Morning at Camp Maple painting, again, by placing Emerson there in the center as the observer of everything around him, you can see that Stillman was also searching for that Emersonian ability to communicate beyond the surface of things in his Adirondack forest photographs, incorporating those glimpses of light as if to make his photographs of nature serve as emblems of eminence. And I really want to reiterate just how truly unique these photographs were at the time that Stillman made them in 1859. There were no other photographers making these sorts of photographs with this kind of ambition in the late 1850s, imbued with both Ruskinian and Emersonian ideals. Now, as for Stillman's later life, his career as a painter not long after this came to a rather bitter end. While painting under Ruskin's harshly critical eye in Switzerland in the early 1860s, Stillman experienced blurry vision, or what he described as a bout of hysterical blindness, and he abandoned painting altogether. And in fact, he did not fully regain his eyesight for another 2 years. He went on to become a diplomat, and he served as the American consul in Rome during the Civil War, and then the consul of Crete. He lived in Athens for a time, and eventually Florence and Rome, as well as London. And really later on, for the later decades of his life, he devoted himself to journalism, writing for major journals and newspapers, including the Times of London, which for a time he served as correspondent for Rome and the Balkans. Now, after the suicide of his first wife, he also made a second happy marriage in 1871 to the much younger pre-Raphaelite model and painter Maurice Bartali. And I'm showing you here her portrait taken by the prominent British photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, and then her own self-portrait from 1871, the year that she and Stillman married. But though he abandoned painting for psychological reasons, he did not abandon photography. In addition to those photographs of the White Mountains that I showed you and the others that are still survive in those photograph albums now in the Union College Library collection, he published a book in 1876 called Poetic Localities of Cambridge, which paired photographs from around Cambridge and Boston with poems by James Russell Lowell, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and others of his American circle. So you can see that he continued to be in touch with many of the men who had been at the Philosophers Camp. And then he developed an interest in archaeology, and he produced a series of photographs called The Acropolis of Athens in 1870, which is probably the series of photographs that he is now the most well known for. He also continued to write art and photography criticism in multiple publications. So though his subsequent life took him in such disparate directions from his beginnings as the American pre-Raphaelite and pioneer of American photography, he would proudly write in his autobiography towards the end of his life that he had, quote, influenced some of my contemporaries and gave a jog to the landscape painting of the day, unquote. And as a final note, as I end my talk, I just want to note too that Stillman returned on one of his trips back to America in 1883 to Ampersand in the Adirondacks to revisit the Adirondack Club's campsite, and he found it in really a dire and desolate state. And sadly, by that time, He was the sole living survivor of that camping expedition from 20 years earlier that had resulted in such an extraordinary painting and such an extraordinary series of photographs. So there's really much more that could be explored with Stillman's fascinating life, but I am going to stop there and I will be happy to take questions. Laura, did you want to moderate the
Yeah,
Q&A?
I'm sorry. It's having a little technical difficulty coming back on screen there. Sorry.
No, you think we would have figured this all out by now, but
Yes.
we still have problems.
So we have a question. Says, during this time when these photographers became more prominent, how were they educated, or how did they gain their experience in the trade?
Well, that's an interesting question in terms of the American photographers. So the sort of first generation of American photographers, the ones who took up the daguerreotype, most of them actually came from various trades, and they really or came from scientific or mechanical backgrounds. So a lot of them took it up out of scientific interest when it was really, really new. And then others, as the daguerreotype became possible as a daguerreotype medium, as a portrait medium, really saw it as a business opportunity. And it really was a very much a business in America, which is a little bit different than the development in Britain and France, where there was a much more robust group of amateurs who adopted photography. And that's sort of why landscape got an earlier start or it's one of the reasons why landscape got an earlier start in Britain and in France. And Stillman is really, again, he's one of the first artists who takes an interest in photography. There were some others too. The brothers of Albert Bierstadt, Charles and Edward Bierstadt, also became photographers. John Moran, who was the brother of the painter Thomas Moran, took up photography as well. And they all sort of started in the late 1850s and into the 1860s. And it's really at that point that what we would think of as a more photography as an artistic endeavor kind of took off in America. And then it really came into its own during the Civil War in the 1860s, when photography was used for so many military uses, but it also sort of trained another generation of photographers in architecture, landscape, photography, and so on.
So when did it become acceptable, or when did artists begin using photography or photographic studies as models for painting? When did that start to become?
Well, I think it started pretty early on, but you would see, oftentimes painters wouldn't really necessarily, admit to that. I mean, certainly, as I mentioned, with the British pre-Raphaelites, if in the early stages they ever used photographs specifically to paint after, they didn't admit to it. I think later on they did, and it's known that Millet and others often used photographs, into the 1860s or 1870s for their paintings. And it's true too. In fact, even the Morning at Camp Maple that Stillman painted, he says that he painted his own figure from a photograph of himself. So that's already there in the late 1850s. So and John Moran, some of the photographs that he was producing, he described them as, I think, photographic art studies, or some language like that. So he was clearly intending them to perhaps be useful for photographers. So there was a pretty close relationship between them from from the early days.
So let me see. Yeah, if any of you have questions, please feel free. Submit them through the Q&A and see if anything else comes through.
Well, I see another question about did Stillman learn the craft of oil painting as an apprentice to other artists? I believe there was one other artist that he briefly studied with besides Frederick Edwin Church. Is there any conjecture about what could have happened to his photographs? Well, I mean, actually quite a few of his photographs do survive in those photograph albums that are now in the Union College. And then there are a lot of his Acropolis of Athens photographs. I don't know how many copies of the Adirondack portfolio he even produced. So, there are at least 4 surviving copies. Of course, if anyone knows where there are others, I'd be happy to hear about it. Maybe some more will surface, but we don't really know how many were produced. And you might have noticed in the slides I was showing that those photographs are actually quite faint. And I think Stillman, I think they may have been printed with the help of another Boston photographer, J.W. Black, or I think Stillman claims that he studied with this photographer briefly. But they're very faded. And I think Stillman was not, if he was making the prints himself, he clearly was not very good at processing his photographs, or did things too quickly, because none of them have survived in very good condition. And there's a few of them where you still get a little bit of that rich purpley color that that are that you see with the most beautiful albumin prints, but a lot of them, they're very orangey, they're very faded. So I think that just wasn't his interest at the time.
So another question asks about the Philosophers Camp. Why is it significant, and why did it not continue? Why was this a one-off?
Well, I mean, the main one was in 1858, and a group did come back in 1859. I believe that another group went camping there at Ampersand Pond in 1860, but by that time Stillman had gone to England, so he wasn't a part of that. And then the Civil War broke out. So I think that pretty quickly, sort of snuffed it out. So it just didn't continue beyond that. I think some of the younger men who had been a part of these various camping expeditions, a lot of them were killed in the Civil War. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Stillman was the sole living survivor of that group when he went back in 1883. I mean, of course, some of the men had been a lot older, so they had passed away, but the younger men, I think, had been killed in the Civil War. So, I think it was mostly that.
There's another question asking, are there more contemporary painters that continue to merge photography with their painting?
Do you mean really, really contemporary? I assume that's what you mean. I mean, there are many artists these days who, work both in painting, photography, a lot of cross-media work, incorporating photography into painting. So, it's a very rich relationship between photography and painting now. And, it was considered a much more distinct thing back in the 19th century. It took a while for photography to really be accepted as an art form. And that's, something we don't really question today. But photography always struggled in the 19th century, was it really and truly an art? And in fact, Stillman is interesting because he wrote things where he pretty much said that he didn't think that photography itself was truly an art, even though he was such a skilled photographer and devoted so much time to it, and abandoned painting really in favor of photography. But he himself, I think, never went quite so far as to say that photography was an art form. And there are others of his contemporaries who did say that, like John Moran, who really argued very actively that photography should be considered an art form that's equal to painting.
Another one is asking if you could please repeat the title of the book that you mentioned by Ruskin.
Oh, Modern Painters. It was published in several volumes over some decades. The first volume, 1843, and then first published in America in 1847.
All right. And then Elena is asking, what type of experience did it seem that Stillman wanted to craft for the participants at the Philosophers Camp?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think he really wanted them to experience the same thing he was experiencing in the Adirondacks or various other places, was to really, truly be immersed in the forest, isolated from civilization. And again, of course, that's the way they would have perceived it. I think, the Adirondacks, of course, had lots of, it had indigenous peoples, I understand, and others living around there, but that's the way that they perceived it, that this was a place that was, true wilderness, where one could go and be truly immersed in the forest. And I think he wanted to create that experience for the group.
So Jessica is asking, does the camp still exist and or has it been incorporated into the park?
I don't have an answer for that question. I would have to defer to people who really know the Adirondacks today. Whether I mean, I assume Ampersand Pond is still there.
Well, that part, yeah, the Fallensby Pond site was private property until many years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, it has been purchased for the site, but it's not publicly accessible. So the piece of property is still there. Whether or not it looks the same, I would guess probably not. And I don't know if anybody has definitively identified exactly where they were, but the property does exist. It hasn't been developed. So it's still there. Another question, probably the last one, I think, for the evening. Well, let me see. Pardon my excellent technical skills. Why did Stillman decide to move to England and remain there for the rest of his life?
Well, he didn't remain in England for the rest of his life. He just remained in various places in Europe, because as I mentioned, he lived in Rome, he lived in Athens, he lived in Crete. Stillman was always, at least initially, living really kind of on the edge financially. He was never able to really make a living as a painter. He was often depending on friends for financial help over the years. And even as the editor of the Cran, that wasn't a financial success. And at the consulate in Rome was kind of a position that, was a way for him to get a kind of a little bit of a steady income. But I think he also just felt, he must have felt a little bit of a sense of, that he had a foot in two worlds, because, he had gone to England first in 1850, and he so admired Ruskin. And, when he went back in 1860, he was able to spend time with Ruskin. And of course, that resulted in, the problems with his vision and giving up painting. But he was very ensconced in the British art community there as well. So he must have been kind of, in two worlds. And that must be why he sort of went back and forth so many times, always returning to America, but then going back. And then, of course, eventually in 1871, he married Marie Bartali Stillman. And, their life was just in Europe at that point.
All right. Well, Diane, thank you very much. This was very informative, very interesting. Thank all of you as well for joining us this evening. Recording of this and all of our speaker programs will be made available on our website. Please join us in early 2022 when we welcome Mohawk scholar Scott Manning Stevens in January and artist Takis Walter in February. Information on these programs and registration site for them is on the adkx.org website. We wish you all the very best as we close out our 2021 programs. May you have a happy and hopefully healthy new year. Thank you again, and thank you to Diane. Have a very good night.